Who would you say has the most recognizable face in Hollywood today? George Clooney? Sandra Bullock? George Clooney spent over a decade with bit parts in highly forgettable films and TV shows before he made his great breakthrough in ER in 1994. Sandra Bullock had the same sort of, shall we say, fallow period for almost the same length of time until coincidentally in 1994 she made her breakthrough in Speed. The Time magazine just recently published a magazine about 100 people of influence. And so whether it was show business or every other form of endeavor, we could tell the same story of people who begin their journey or their careers in fairly minor and insignificant roles before coming to prominence. And indeed, many of the people in that 100 people of influence list are not necessarily thrilled with the status that society gives to them. And it's the same with you and me. We all play a role in life. We play several roles in life. And most of us never make it to superstar status. We spend our time doing the things that we are invited and called to do in the drama of life. And if we were making a show about the sorts of roles that most of us fill, it probably wouldn't even make it into that late night dead zone when we watch TV when we can't fall asleep. And yet, whenever God does things in the world, it seems that overwhelmingly God chooses to do them through small players. Oh, sure, there are significant events that get into the history books, and there are some big names that get into the headlines, but overwhelmingly, God seems to choose to reclaim and heal the world a little bit at a time. And sometimes that little bit that God is reclaiming is your life and mine. The conversion and calling of Saul is one of those great stories that is etched into the history of the church. Saul was a challenging personality, a man of great intelligence and great drive, deeply committed to the old ways of authority and the old ways of knowing. And he found it personally offensive that the followers of Jesus would take this crucified criminal and place him in the role of God's holy Messiah. And so he started this persecution in Jerusalem, and many followers of Jesus were taken away, they were put in prison, they were punished, and a huge number of them fled from Jerusalem. They dispersed to a whole lot of different communities. It was a great day for the old faith. Saul felt vindicated. But then word came that these followers of Jesus, also known as followers of the way, these followers of Jesus, instead of realizing that they were beaten and shutting up, were telling the story of Jesus everywhere they went. And so instead of solving the problem and containing it, Saul, by his persecution, had actually spread it. You stomp it out one place, it arises in 3 other places. And so Saul was filled with fury. He had himself deputized, and he arranged for a posse, and they rode off to Damascus to collect some more of these followers of Jesus. And just outside Damascus, the story tells us, a bright light shone, a voice spoke, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Saul, in that moment, was transformed from being the in-charge, tough leader to Paul, blind, unable to speak, who had to be led by the hand, who was in charge of nothing. he's told, go into the city. It's a wonderful story, but it's Paul's story. Sometimes in the church we make the mistake of saying that if you haven't had a Paul-like experience, you're not really a Christian. Right? You've heard that, I'm sure. That's the sort of response that's being asked for when people say, have you been saved? And God bless them, there are people who can tell you the day and the time and the place and what they were doing when they had that experience. But that's their experience. For other people, their experience is more like the unfolding of a bud to a flower. How do you tell when a bud becomes a flower? You just know that it is. And so, regardless of how we experience that invitation to be Christ's, the invitation comes to us. And I don't think we should put any restrictions on the way in which God acts. Poor Ananias. Try and put yourself in his sandals. Here he is. He's the leader of this small group of people following the way. And he knows that there are lots of important people who don't like them. Remember, Jesus, whom they revere as the Messiah, was executed as a traitor, a capital criminal by the Romans. That's not happy. And he knows that the leaders of the Jewish community and the followers of Jesus are still Jews at this point. The leaders of the Jewish community don't think very much of them. And then there are people like Saul who are quite actively the enemy. So what would you do if you were the leader of the community? Would you go underground, hide your head, keep out of everybody's sight? Well, that might preserve you, but Jesus has given you this task. Go and make more disciples. And if you're hiding in a basement somewhere, it's really hard to make more disciples. So Ananias is doing his level best, and then he has this vision and a voice speaks to him. Notice that Ananias doesn't need to ask who's talking to him. He knows when God speaks. So he knows the voice, and he receives the mission. But what a mission. Paul is being led around by the hand. He's not in charge of anything. He can't eat or drink. He's over there on Straight Street, and Ananias is told to go and lay his hands on him and heal him. Now, Ananias may not be a big name in the Bible. In fact, today may be the first time you've ever heard of him. But he's not a shrinking violet. He pushes back and says, "Excuse me, Saul? Are we talking about the same Saul? The one with the reputation of hurting and killing and imprisoning followers of Jesus? Are we talking about that Saul?" And the voice says, "Go, because I have big plans for him." Poor Ananias. I wonder, when he strapped on the sandals that morning and he kissed his wife and children goodbye, did he think that was the last time he might see them? As he walked through the city, the familiar sights and smells, did he think, as he went into the grasp of the persecutor, did he think that was the last time he might experience those? Sadly, we'll never know, because as quickly as Ananias appears in the story, he then disappears. He plays his part in the story that God is writing and then disappears. But you know what? Without Ananias, there would not have been Paul. There would only have been Saul, locked in his anger and his bitter hatred. And without Paul, none of us, unless some of you happen to be Jewish by descent, none of us would be here. Because it was Paul who brought the message of Jesus to the Gentiles. and began the process of bringing Gentiles into the covenant with Jesus. So, no Ananias, no Paul, really no church. It's not a part that it doesn't get you to walk on the red carpet at the Oscars. But without it, history would be very, very different. But what if Ananias had reacted differently? What if he said, God, I don't mind talking to people down at Tim's about Jesus. And I even kind of like welcoming new folks when they come to church. That's okay. But if you think I'm going over to Straight Street and talk to that murderous so-and-so just because he's had an experience, you can think again. What if Ananias had reacted like that? But he didn't. All he knew was that Saul was the worst sort of enemy that he could think of, and yet God said to Ananias, go, heal him, call him brother. Well, what about us? Which of these characters in our story do you think has had the greater call and conversion experience? Could it be Saul, who becomes Paul, the persecutor of the way, who becomes the greatest exponent of the story in history? Or is it Ananias? Ananias, who, on the strength of a voice and a vision, chooses to go to a place of danger and touch and heal someone he has learned to call enemy. God calls each one of us. You see, when we come to love Jesus, we also come to love the people Jesus loves. And Jesus keeps reaching out and gathering in more people, not necessarily people that we would choose. And sometimes loving Jesus is hard enough, but loving the people that Jesus chooses to love? Holy smokes. Gotta sometimes wonder about the taste that this guy has. Anyway, but then we are like Ananias. And God says to us, go. So whether you've had the dramatic Paul-like experience of faith, whether you've had the unfolding of the bud to the flower experience of faith, God still calls you. God calls us to play a role. And there's no such thing as an unimportant follower of Jesus. If you are a follower of Jesus, you cannot at the same time say, I'm just and fill in the blank, so I'm not important. Ananias was somebody who, in the eyes of the world, was considered to be quite unimportant, but he had a crucial role. You are part of God's work in healing this tired world. It was back in the 1990s, and Saddam Hussein was busily trying to bomb and gas the Kurdish minority into non-existence. And the church I was serving in Kingston, Ontario, along with a couple of other churches, were trying to gather the resources together to sponsor a refugee family. But we had to have enough money in cash in the bank to sponsor 5 people, fully support them for 2 years, which is a fair amount of change. And we were having difficulty raising the money, and every day the headlines were worse. And then one evening I was working late in the office, and an older retired couple came into my office and presented me with a check for the whole amount. Now, I knew enough about their circumstances to know that this was a fair piece of their retirement savings. And I was sort of stunned, and I said, well, thank you, but how can you do this? And you know, this is a Muslim family that we're talking about. And she replied, we're Christians. Do you think it's always easy? She's right. It's not always easy. It wasn't easy for Saul to become Paul. It wasn't easy for Ananias to take that walk into the hands of the persecutors. Ananias is not a super Christian. He's barely mentioned. He probably didn't know Jesus before the crucifixion. He's not a megastar. Nobody will ever hand him an Academy Award for Christian service. He's just an ordinary Christian, cleverly disguised as somebody that the world does not take seriously. And when Christ calls us, he calls us to change. He takes ordinary lives and makes us into saints. Courageous people who are willing to relate to other people as Jesus relates to them, not thinking about somebody else in terms of categories that we've learned to hate or despise or fear. People who don't let their littleness get in the way. People who, when God says go, do not necessarily respond with but. People who are willing to treat others as brothers and sisters. Let those with ears hear the Spirit's word to the church.